On the morning of May 1, 1960, a U-2 spy plane disappeared over Soviet airspace near Sverdlovsk. The pilot's name was Francis Gary Powers. Within 72 hours, every intelligence agency in the Western world knew he was alive, captured, and being prepared for show trial in Moscow. But there was another American pilot, one whose name never made it into the history books. His plane went down 3 years later over the Ural Mountains during a covert reconnaissance mission that officially never happened. The CIA listed him as missing. The Air Force declared him dead. His file was sealed. His wife refused to believe either story. Her name was Claire Donovan. And what she did next would become one of the most audacious and tragic acts of Cold War desperation ever attempted by a civilian. This is the story of how an ordinary schoolteacher from Ohio walked into the Soviet Union, lived there for 4 years under a false identity, and nearly pulled off the impossible, until the person she trusted most turned her in. The year was 1963. The world was holding its breath. Just months earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis had brought humanity to the edge of nuclear annihilation. Khrushchev and Kennedy had stared each other down across an invisible line drawn in the Caribbean Sea. And somehow, through luck, fear, or exhausted reason, both sides had blinked. But the thaw was temporary. The Cold War didn't end. It simply learned to smile while sharpening its knives. In Washington, the newly expanded National Security Agency was vacuuming up radio signals from every corner of the globe, feeding them into roomfuls of IBM computers that hummed through the night like mechanical priests. In Moscow, the KGB's second chief directorate was doing the same, only with more cigarettes and less air conditioning. Berlin remained divided by concrete and barbed wire. Prague was a city of whispers. Budapest still bled from '56. And across the Iron Curtain, invisible threads of suspicion connected every telephone line, every embassy, every foreign visitor who smiled too easily or asked the wrong questions. This was the world Claire Donovan chose to enter, not as a spy, not as a soldier, but as a woman who had run out of options and discovered that love, when pushed far enough, becomes indistinguishable from insanity. Her husband, Captain Robert Donovan, had been flying reconnaissance missions out of Incirlik Air Base in Turkey since early 1962. Officially, he was stationed there as part of a routine NATO rotation. Unofficially, he was one of several dozen pilots tasked with what the Pentagon called peripheral surveillance, flying close enough to Soviet borders to provoke radar responses, mapping defensive installations, testing reaction times. It was cold, methodical work, the kind that required nerve and a particular breed of fatalism. On the night of November 14, 1963, Robert Donovan took off in a modified RF-101 Voodoo reconnaissance jet on what his mission log described as a routine navigation exercise. He never returned. The official telegram arrived at Claire's home in Dayton, Ohio, 6 days later. It was delivered by an Air Force chaplain and a young officer whose uniform still looked too new. The language was precise and emotionless. Missing in action. Search efforts ongoing. Presumed lost. Claire read it twice, folded it neatly, and asked them to leave. She didn't cry. Not then. She went to the kitchen, made coffee she didn't drink, and sat at the table until the sun came up. The house was small and tidy, the kind of place where every surface was clean and every object had its assigned location. There were no children. They'd been trying for 3 years. The spare bedroom had been ready since 1961, painted yellow, furniture waiting, a mobile hanging motionless above an empty crib. Robert used to joke that the kid was just being tactical, waiting for the right moment to deploy. Claire would smile and say nothing because she knew he was scared too. Now the room was a monument to a future that would never arrive. Over the following weeks, Claire received the standard follow-up from the Air Force. Condolence letters, information about survivor benefits, a flag folded into a triangle. Friends visited with casseroles and carefully chosen words. Her mother flew in from Pennsylvania and stayed for a week, moving quietly through the house like a nurse tending to someone whose injury couldn't be seen. But Claire wasn't grieving. She was calculating. Because 3 weeks after the telegram arrived, she received a phone call that changed everything. It came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. She picked up on the second ring. There was silence on the other end. Not the silence of an empty line, but the weighted silence of someone deciding whether to speak. Then a man's voice, low and cautious, with an accent she couldn't place. "Mrs. Donovan?" "Yes." "Your husband is alive." She didn't breathe. "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter. What matters is that he's being held in a detention facility east of Sverdlovsk. He was injured in the crash but survived. They've kept him isolated. No trial yet. No announcement. They're deciding what to do with him. How do you... I can't tell you more. I shouldn't have called at all. But you deserve to know." The line went dead. Claire stood in the dark kitchen, the receiver still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone like it was a voice she recognized. She didn't sleep that night. By morning, she'd made a decision that most people would call suicidal. She was going to find him. The first problem was simple. She had no idea how to get into the Soviet Union, let alone locate a secret detention facility in the Urals. The second problem was harder. Even if she succeeded, she had no training, no connections, no leverage. She was a 31-year-old elementary school teacher with a degree in English literature and no experience beyond grading spelling tests and attending PTA meetings. But she had something else. She had nothing left to lose. For the next 6 months, Claire Donovan became a student of deception. She started by reading everything she could find about the Soviet Union, not propaganda, not political theory, but practical details. How did ordinary people live? What did they eat? How did they dress, speak, move through the world? She borrowed Russian-language textbooks from the public library and played linguaphone records in her living room until her neighbors complained. She studied maps, memorizing cities and rail lines and rivers. She read travel memoirs by Western journalists who had visited Moscow, looking for patterns, entry points, vulnerabilities. And slowly, an idea began to take shape. The Soviet Union, for all its paranoia, had one weakness. It was desperate to prove itself legitimate. It wanted to show the world that life behind the Iron Curtain wasn't a prison camp, that Soviet citizens were educated, cultured, modern. And one way it did this was by inviting foreign teachers and technical experts to work in Soviet schools and universities, people who could be monitored, controlled, and used for propaganda purposes. Claire applied to 3 different educational exchange programs. 2 rejected her outright. The third, a Soviet-run initiative called the International Friendship Teaching Corps, accepted her application after a 6-week vetting process that included interviews, background checks, and a written essay on the role of education in fostering global peace. She lied on every document. She claimed to be a widow. She omitted any mention of her husband's military service. She described herself as politically progressive, sympathetic to socialist ideals, eager to experience Soviet society firsthand. She quoted Tolstoy and Chekhov. She praised the achievements of Soviet science. She made herself exactly what they wanted: naive, idealistic, harmless, and it worked. On August 3, 1964, Claire Donovan boarded an Aeroflot flight from Paris to Moscow, carrying a single suitcase, a forged teaching certificate, and a plan she hadn't told anyone about, because there was no one left to tell. In the summer of 1964 was a city of contrasts. On the surface, it projected strength, wide boulevards built for military parades. Stalinist skyscrapers that loomed like concrete sentinels, red banners stretched across building facades proclaiming the triumph of the proletariat. But underneath, it was exhausted. The buildings were crumbling. The plumbing didn't work. The grocery stores had lines that stretched around corners, and the bread was often stale by the time you reached the counter. The air smelled like diesel and boiled cabbage. Winter coats were patched and repatched. Shoes wore out faster than they could be replaced. People moved through the streets with a particular kind of vigilance, not fear, exactly, but a constant low-level awareness that someone might be watching, because someone always was. Claire was assigned to a secondary school in the Arbat district, an old neighborhood near the city center where pre-revolutionary buildings leaned against Soviet-era apartment blocks like tired relatives at a funeral. Her apartment was on the fourth floor of a building with no elevator. 2 rooms with walls the color of old paper, a narrow bed, a table, a single hot plate, and a window that overlooked a courtyard where pigeons fought over breadcrumbs. She shared the floor with 5 other families. The bathroom was communal. The walls were thin enough that she could hear every argument, every cough, every late-night radio program playing in the apartment next door. She taught English to teenagers who sat in rows and repeated phrases with mechanical precision. "Good morning. How are you?" "I am fine, thank you." They were polite, disciplined, and terrified of making mistakes. Their textbooks were outdated and filled with propaganda, stories about heroic factory workers and the glories of collective farming. Claire followed the curriculum exactly. She smiled. She praised their progress. She never asked personal questions. And in the evenings, after the school day ended, she began her real work. She started with the radio. Soviet domestic broadcasts were tightly controlled, but the airwaves themselves were harder to regulate. Every night, Claire would sit by her window with a small shortwave radio she'd smuggled in, scanning frequencies, listening to the voices that bled through the static. Voice of America, BBC World Service, Radio Free Europe. These were illegal to listen to, but enforcement was inconsistent. If you kept the volume low and the curtains closed, you could get away with it. But Claire wasn't listening for news. She was listening for patterns. Because buried within those broadcasts, hidden in the gaps between programs, in the music selections, in the timing of certain announcements, were messages. Number stations, coded signals sent to operatives in the field. Most of it was noise, meaningless to anyone without the cipher. But Claire had learned something during her months of preparation. Intelligence agencies on both sides used public radio as a communication channel precisely because it was so cluttered, so dense with information that a single anomaly could disappear into the background. She needed to create her own anomaly. It took 3 months of careful observation. But eventually she identified her opening. A local Moscow radio station that broadcast community announcements every evening at 7 p.m. Lost pets, apartment listings, public service reminders. It was mundane, bureaucratic, and largely ignored, which made it perfect. Claire befriended a woman named Irina who worked as a typist at the station. They met at a communal laundry facility, bonding over broken washing machines and the universal frustration of trying to dry clothes in a city where it rained more than it didn't. Irina was in her late 40s, divorced, lonely, and hungry for conversation. Claire became her friend slowly, carefully, over shared tea and complaints about the weather. And after 4 months, when Irina mentioned that the radio station was always short-staffed and looking for people to help. "Organize announcement cards," Claire volunteered. No one questioned it. Foreign teachers were encouraged to integrate into Soviet life. Volunteering was ideologically correct. And reading lost dog announcements on the radio was about as harmless as a foreigner could get. Except that Claire wasn't reading them exactly as written. She developed a system. Every 3rd Tuesday, she would insert a slight variation into one of the announcements, a transposed number, an unusual phrasing, a name that didn't quite match the standard format. To anyone listening casually, it sounded like a mistake. But to someone who knew what to listen for, someone monitoring foreign communications, someone with access to decryption protocols, it was a signal. A signal that said, "I am here, I am American, I need extraction intel." She had no idea if anyone was listening. She had no confirmation, no response, no way of knowing if her messages were even being received, but she kept broadcasting. Because the alternative was admitting that Robert was beyond reach, and she wasn't ready to do that. Not yet. Winter arrived in Moscow like a sentence. The cold was absolute. It didn't creep in gradually. It dropped like a curtain in mid-November and stayed until April. The streets turned to ice. The sky became a uniform gray. Buildings groaned under the weight of snow. Pipes froze and burst. People walked with their heads down, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, moving quickly from one heated space to another. Claire's apartment had a radiator that clanked and hissed, but produced only enough warmth to keep the air just above freezing. She slept in her coat. She boiled water on the hot plate and held the cup between her hands for warmth. She learned to move slowly, conserve energy, ration heat like it was food. And she kept teaching. And she kept broadcasting. By January 1965, she'd been in Moscow for 5 months. She'd made no progress toward finding Robert. She had no contacts, no leverage, no confirmation that he was even alive. The isolation was crushing. She couldn't confide in anyone. Every conversation was a performance. Every friendship was tactical. She lived in a state of constant calculation, measuring every word, every gesture, every glance. The loneliness was worse than the cold. But then something changed. On a Tuesday in late January, after her evening broadcast, a man approached her outside the radio station. He was in his 50s, wearing a heavy overcoat and a fur hat that covered most of his face. He didn't introduce himself. He simply walked beside her for half a block, hands in his pockets, breath misting in the frozen air. Then he spoke, in English, barely above a whisper. "You've been very patient, Mrs. Donovan." She didn't stop walking, didn't look at him. "Who are you?" "A friend of a friend." The kind who listens to radio broadcasts. Her heart was pounding, but her voice stayed level. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't. But hypothetically, if someone were trying to locate an American pilot being held east of Sverdlovsk, that someone should know that the facility in question is a military detention center near Chelyabinsk 40. It's not on any map. It doesn't officially exist. But it's real." He handed her a folded piece of paper, still walking, not breaking stride. Hypothetically. Then he turned down a side street and disappeared into the snow. Claire kept walking for another 10 minutes before she allowed herself to look at the paper. It was a train schedule. Moscow to Chelyabinsk. Departures every Thursday. And written in pencil at the bottom. Barely legible. Platform 7. March 4th. Midnight. She burned the paper that night in the sink of her apartment, watching the ash dissolve in water. But she memorized every word. The train to Chelyabinsk left Moscow at 11:47 p.m. on March 4th, 1965. Claire boarded from Platform 7, carrying a small canvas bag and a forged travel permit she'd obtained through a contact. Irina had mentioned once a man who worked in the district housing office and had a reputation for helping people navigate bureaucratic obstacles for the right price. She'd paid him with a bottle of American whiskey she'd brought from Ohio and hidden in the lining of her suitcase. He'd asked no questions. She'd offered no explanations. The train was a relic from the Stalin era, narrow bunks stacked 3 high, dim overhead bulbs that flickered with the rhythm of the tracks, air thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco, and cheap sausage. Claire found her assigned bunk in a third-class compartment shared with a dozen other passengers, factory workers heading east for reassignment. An elderly woman visiting family, a young soldier on leave who kept his eyes down and his mouth shut. No one spoke. The train lurched forward, and Moscow began to slide past the window. First, the lights of the outer districts. Then the industrial zones with their smokestacks and warehouses. Then nothing but darkness and snow. Claire didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bunk, staring out the window at the vast emptiness of the Russian interior. The landscape was featureless, infinite, hostile. Occasionally a village would appear, a cluster of wooden houses with dim yellow windows, and then vanish back into the void. The train moved through the night like a capsule traveling through space, disconnected from everything except its own forward momentum. She thought about Robert. She thought about the last time she'd seen him, standing in the doorway of their house in Dayton, wearing his flight suit, kissing her forehead the way he always did before deployment. He'd said something about bringing her back a snow globe from Turkey. She'd laughed and told him she didn't collect snow globes. He'd said, "Well, maybe it's time you started. That was 16 months ago." She wondered if he remembered her voice. She wondered if he thought she was still alive. or if he'd convinced himself she'd moved on. Remarried, built a new life without him. She wondered if he hated her for not coming sooner. The train arrived in Chelyabinsk at 9:30 a.m. on March 6th. The city was a sprawl of gray concrete and industrial machinery, built around steel mills and weapons factories that consumed the landscape like open wounds. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, staining the sky a permanent shade of rust. The air smelled like burning metal and coal. Everything was covered in a fine layer of soot. Claire stepped off the train into a crowd of workers and soldiers, pulling her coat tight against the wind. She had no map, no address. Only a name the man in Moscow had whispered to her in that final moment before disappearing: Yakov Petrov. She found him in a workers' cafeteria near the train station, a squat, brick building with fogged-up windows and a handwritten menu nailed to the door. Inside, the air was warm and thick with steam from pots of boiling potatoes. Men sat at long tables, eating in silence, shoulders hunched, eyes focused on their plates. Yakov Petrov was sitting alone at a corner table, drinking tea from a chipped enamel cup. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, thin, with sharp features and the kind of stillness that suggested he'd learned long ago how to become invisible. Claire sat down across from him without asking permission. He didn't look up. "You're late," he said quietly, in English. "The train was delayed." Trains are always delayed. He took a slow sip of tea, still not meeting her eyes. "You shouldn't be here, I know. If they catch you, they'll send you to a labor camp. If they catch me, they'll shoot me." "I know." He finally looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Because he's my husband." Yakov studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was brave or simply insane. Then he set down his cup and leaned forward slightly. "The facility is 40 kilometers northeast of here. It's disguised as a mining research station, but it's run by military intelligence. High security, perimeter fences, guard towers, dogs. Your husband is being held in the medical wing. They've been treating an injury to his leg from the crash. He's ambulatory, but limited mobility. Can you get me inside?" "No." "Then what? I can get you close. There's a supply convoy that runs to the facility every Tuesday and Friday. Medical supplies, food, equipment. It's driven by civilian contractors, local men who've been vetted but aren't military. I know one of them. He owes me a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The kind that means he won't ask questions if I tell him to hide someone in the back of his truck." Claire felt her pulse quicken. "And once I'm inside?" Yakov reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. "This is a floor plan. Copied from memory, so it's not perfect, but it's close. The medical wing is on the second floor, east side. Your husband is in room 14. The guards change shifts at 6 p.m. and 2 a.m. The night shift is smaller, 3 men for the entire building. If you move quietly and avoid the main corridors, you might make it to his room undetected. And then what? That's up to you." "How do I get out?" Yakov leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You don't." Claire stared at him. "What? There's no extraction plan. No escape route. If you go in there, you're not coming out. Not unless you have a miracle in your pocket. Then why are you helping me?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because I had a brother," he said finally. "He was a journalist. He wrote the wrong article. They took him in 1952. I never saw him again. I spent 10 years trying to find him. I never did." He stood up, buttoning his coat. "The convoy leaves Friday at dawn. Meet me at the freight depot behind the rail yard. If you're not there, I'll assume you changed your mind." He walked out without looking back. Claire sat alone at the table, staring at the floor plan, her hands trembling. She had 3 days. The freight depot was a maze of rusted shipping containers and stacked pallets, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. Claire arrived at 5:30 a.m. on Friday, March 12th, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like a shadow. Yakov was waiting near a loading dock, smoking a cigarette, his breath visible in the frozen air. He didn't greet her, just nodded toward a covered truck idling nearby. "Back of the truck, under the tarps. Don't move. Don't make a sound." The driver's name is Dmitri. He doesn't know who you are, and he doesn't want to know. If you're discovered, he'll deny everything. Understood? Claire nodded. Jaco flicked his cigarette into the snow. Good luck, Mrs. Donovan. She climbed into the back of the truck, burrowing beneath layers of canvas tarps and wooden crates marked with Cyrillic labels she couldn't read. The space was cramped, airless, and smelled like diesel and damp cloth. The engine rumbled to life, and the truck lurched forward, bouncing over uneven roads. The journey took 2 hours. Claire lost track of time in the darkness, her body jolting with every pothole, her breath shallow and controlled. She focused on staying silent, staying still, even as her muscles cramped and her lungs burned. Finally, the truck slowed. She heard voices outside, Russian, clipped, authoritative. A guard asking for papers. Dmitri responding, calm and routine. The sound of boots on gravel. A flashlight beam sweeping across the tarps above her. Then the guard waved them through. The truck rolled forward another 100 meters and stopped. Dmitri knocked twice on the wall of the cargo bed, the signal. Claire waited until she heard him walk away, then carefully pushed aside the tarps and climbed out. She was standing in a loading bay behind a large, nondescript building that looked like an administrative complex. No signs, no markings. Just concrete, steel, and wire. She pulled the floor plan from her coat and oriented herself. East side. 2nd floor. Room 14. She moved quickly, staying close to the walls, avoiding the main entrance. There was a service door near the back, unlocked, just as Yakov had said it would be. She slipped inside. The interior was institutional. Pale green walls, fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant and stale air. A long corridor stretched ahead, doors on either side, most of them closed. She could hear voices somewhere deeper in the building, muffled, distant. She found the stairwell and climbed to the 2nd floor, every footstep a potential alarm. The hallway on the 2nd floor was narrower, dimmer. She counted the doors. 8, 10, 12. She stopped outside the door, her hand on the handle, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter. She pushed the door open. Inside, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, wearing a faded hospital gown and a bandage around his left leg, was Robert. He looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his face collapsed and he whispered, "Claire?" She crossed the room in 3 steps and fell into his arms. They didn't speak. There were no words left. They just held each other, shaking, breathing, trying to confirm that the other was real. Finally, Robert pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, staring at her like she was a ghost. "How?" "Later," she whispered. "We have to move. Claire, you can't be here. If they find you, I know. But I'm not leaving without you." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted, resignation mixing with something close to awe. "You're insane." "Yes." He stood, testing his weight on his injured leg, wincing but managing. "Where do we go?" "I don't know yet, but we go together." They made it as far as the stairwell before the alarm sounded. It started as a low electronic pulse, then escalated into a piercing siren that filled the building like a scream. Red lights began flashing in the corridors. Doors slammed open. Boots thundered on concrete. Robert grabbed her hand. "Run!" They descended the stairs 2 at a time. Robert limping but keeping pace, Claire pulling him forward. They burst through the service door and into the loading bay. But it was too late. Soldiers were already converging from multiple directions, rifles raised, shouting in Russian. Claire and Robert stopped. There was nowhere left to go. A man in an officer's uniform stepped forward, flanked by 2 guards. He was in his 50s, with cold eyes and the kind of face that had stopped showing emotion decades ago. He looked at Claire, then at Robert, then back at Claire. "Mrs. Donovan," he said in perfect English. "We've been expecting you." Claire felt the ground tilt beneath her. "What?" The officer smiled, a thin, joyless expression. "Did you really think we didn't know? We've been monitoring your radio broadcasts for months. Every message, every code, every desperate little signal you sent into the void." He stepped closer. "We let you come here. We wanted to see how far you'd go." Claire's mind was reeling. No, that's not. The man in Moscow? The one who gave you the train schedule? He works for us. Yakov Petrov? Also ours. Even the phone call you received in Ohio, that was us. Robert was staring at her, his face pale. Claire, what is he talking about? The officer ignored him. You were never going to succeed, Mrs. Donovan. This was always a trap, and you walked into it beautifully. Claire felt something break inside her. Not hope, because she'd abandoned that long ago. Something deeper, something structural. Why? She whispered. The officer shrugged. Because we wanted to see if the Americans would come for him. And when they didn't, we wanted to see if you would. Turns out love makes people stupider than ideology ever could. He signaled to the guards. Take them both. Claire and Robert were separated immediately. She was placed in a windowless cell with a concrete floor and a metal cot. No trial, no charges, just silence. For 6 months, she saw no one except the guard who brought her meals. Thin soup, black bread, water that tasted like rust. She tried to track time by counting meals, but eventually she lost count. She thought about Robert constantly, wondering if he was in a cell nearby, wondering if he knew she'd tried, wondering if he blamed her. She thought about the house in Dayton, the yellow spare bedroom, the mobile hanging motionless above the empty crib. She thought about the radio broadcasts, the codes she'd sent into the void, the hope she'd carried like a stone. And she thought about how easily hope can be weaponized. In November 1965, a guard opened her cell door and told her she was being released. No explanation. No paperwork. Just a bus ride to Moscow and a flight to Helsinki, where she was handed over to American embassy officials who treated her like a lost package. She never saw Robert again. According to Soviet records declassified in 1991, Captain Robert Donovan died in detention on August 3, 1965, 5 months after Claire's arrival at the facility, due to complications from pneumonia. There was no body returned, no confirmation. Just a line in a file that was sealed for 26 years. Claire Donovan returned to the United States in December 1965. She never spoke publicly about what happened. She refused interviews. She declined to cooperate with CIA debriefings. She moved to a small town in Oregon, changed her name, and worked as a librarian until she retired in 1989. She never remarried. In 2003, a journalist tracked her down and asked if she'd be willing to share her story. She declined, but before closing the door, she said something that stayed with him. I thought love was stronger than walls. Turns out walls are just walls, and love is just another way of being alone. She died in 2011, at the age of 79 in a nursing home outside Portland. Her obituary made no mention of Moscow or Robert or the 4 years she spent trying to pull off the impossible. It listed her as a retired librarian who enjoyed gardening and classic films. The Cold War didn't end because one side won. It ended because both sides got tired of pretending they were fighting for something other than control. But the people caught in between, the ones who believed in something beyond systems and borders, they didn't get tired. They just disappeared. Claire Donovan's story is one of thousands that will never be fully told. Not because they're classified, but because they're too painful to look at directly. They remind us that history isn't made by nations or ideologies. It's made by people who do desperate things in the dark, hoping someone, somewhere, is listening. And sometimes, no one is. If stories like this make you reflect on the cost of courage, the kind that doesn't end in victory parades or monuments, but in silence and footnotes, consider subscribing. There are many more Cold War stories buried in archives and memories, waiting to be remembered before they're forgotten completely. Because the truth is, the Cold War never really ended for the people who lived through it. It just became a story we tell ourselves about a time when the world was simpler, clearer, more black and white. But Claire Donovan knew better. She knew the only color that mattered was gray. And in that gray, she loved a man, crossed an ocean, entered an enemy state, and tried to do something that should have been impossible. She failed, but she tried. And maybe in the end that's the only victory that matters.